Every day, general aviation aircraft depart on thousands of flights, the vast majority of them incident-free. But for about 4 a day on average, the landings aren't so happy. Most of these accidents are relatively minor, but whatever the severity, passengers aboard the aircraft fare better if they have basic knowledge to help them survive the crash, get out of the aircraft, and contact rescue personnel. In this video, we'll look at what you as a pilot can do to maximize their chances. As student pilots, we were all taught to give passengers a short safety briefing prior to every flight. But with the check ride long past and the Hobbs meter running, there's sometimes a tendency to gloss over the briefing or even skip it. After all, it's simple stuff that everybody knows, right? That's not really the case. If there's one rule that applies to everything we'll cover, it's not to make assumptions about what non-pilot passengers do and don't know. So let's take a look at what they need to know. The most obvious item in any safety briefing, and the only one specifically required by the FARs, is the use of seat belts and harnesses.
The most critical thing in surviving a general aviation accident, if there's a chance to survive, is the restraint that you're wearing, or in some cases not wearing.
Passengers are required to wear lap belts and, if available, shoulder harnesses during taxi, takeoff, and landing. Like the airlines, you need to be sure they put them on, and also like the airlines, urge them to keep at least their lap belts fastened the entire flight. Most people are familiar with airplane-style seatbelt latches, but don't just assume that. Demonstrate how the latches work, as well as how the shoulder harness attaches to the lap belt if you have the two-piece variety. If the aircraft has multi-point harnesses, this part of the briefing should get significantly more emphasis.
We have different kinds of seatbelts in general aviation aircraft that are on transport category aircraft or that are in your car. So it's not just push a button, it's lift a latch, or in some cases it's turn a rotary buckle. There may be a 4-point restraint involved, and this may be someone's first flight in that kind of a restraint.
As an aside, many older aircraft were certified without shoulder belts and can fly legally without them. That said, a recent NTSB study found that the risk of serious injury or death in a crash is 50% higher when only the lap belt is used. Bottom line, it's money well spent to have shoulder belts installed.
So equipping your aircraft, especially with shoulder harnesses and using them at all times, is the first step you can keep yourself safe, because there's no point in discussing the post-crash environment or post-crash search and rescue if you don't survive the accident to begin with.
For aircraft owners, it's also worth noting that seatbelt-mounted airbag systems are now available for many light aircraft. These are effective in preventing the blunt force injuries to the face and abdomen many accident victims suffer.
We've actually had a pilot that died due to hypothermia, successfully had a forced landing, but searchers didn't find this individual for over 4 or 5 days, and they had survived with little injury, only to die of exposure because they had no clothing suitable for the terrain that they happened to have wrecked at. And that's one thing I would brief passengers ahead of time, that pretend you have to stay overnight wherever it is that we're flying over, and be sure to bring adequate clothes for that eventuality.
Getting out of the aircraft after the crash is the next issue. Doors are the most obvious means of escape, but even more than with seatbelts, this is a place where you shouldn't make assumptions about passenger knowledge.
You'd be surprised how many people, given a circumstance where they've been thrown into an accident scenario, have difficulty simply opening a door, because doors on aircraft don't operate a lot of times just like they do on a car.
Be sure to explain in clear terms exactly how to unlatch cabin doors. It may even be worth having a new passenger walk through the steps once just to be sure. This is especially true in aircraft with multiple latches, like Pipers, or ones that require 2 actions at once, Beech Bonanzas, for example. In a crash landing, one major concern is that the fuselage will deform and cause the doors to bind. You can probably skip this for a normal briefing, But prior to an emergency landing, have passengers open a door and jam something in to hold it open, a coat or whatever else they can find. Failing that, re-engaging the latch while holding the door open will usually keep it from closing again. If the doors are blocked, windows can be broken as a means of escape. If you have a special tool for this, let passengers know where it is. Otherwise, kicking will generally break or dislodge plexiglass windows.
Maryland State Police had the Trooper 2 helicopter crash a few years ago just outside of Andrews Air Force Base, 3 miles off the end of the runway, and it took them more than 2 hours to find the accident scene. The helicopter route was being actively tracked with ADSB at the time, with providing 1-second updates to its position. It was shocking for a lot of people how 3 miles off the end of the runway where the president lands, where you have a highly urban environment and you have all the technology available, it can still take a long time just to even recognize that there had been an accident. So you see that it's not as simple as, well, I don't fly very far from home, so I don't need to think about this stuff.
Cabin fires in flight are relatively rare, but they do happen, and they're deadly serious. If you don't have a fire extinguisher, we highly recommend you buy one. Halon extinguishers are by far the best choice for use in aircraft, and they're relatively inexpensive. Be sure to mount the extinguisher in a location where it's easily accessible in flight, and point it out to passengers during your safety briefing.
Survival equipment of any kind is beneficial, and you can get a very simple survival kit, which can include very small and lightweight items for pretty cheap. In fact, one of the things I tell people is that the next time someone's asking you for a birthday gift, a Christmas gift, or something, is a $50 gift card to any sort of camping store out there. You can put one together yourself. That's fantastic. You can buy some Mylar blankets, signaling mirror, whistle. Very small, very lightweight items that can make a big difference.
And I love space blankets because not only are they great signal devices, they're very shiny. You can lay them out. You can make all sorts of signals with that. But it's afterwards. It's the survival aspect of that, to have something to retain body heat.
Imagine yourself as a non-pilot passenger in an aircraft that's just crash-landed. The pilot is unresponsive, and the other passengers are gravely injured. Your only hope of survival is to be rescued soon. But you're deep in the wilderness. Will anyone know where to look? How will you call for help? It's not a common situation, but it has happened before, notably in the crash that killed Senator Ted Stevens. Crash survivors have found themselves stranded in remote areas with communications gear close at hand, but without the critical knowledge they needed to locate and use it. There's no way to plan for every possible contingency, but you should make it a point to tell passengers about any emergency communication gear and survival equipment aboard the aircraft. In other words, if I were incapacitated, what would they need to know to get help? Here are some examples of information to include. For communication, handheld transceivers are a good place to start.
If a pilot has a handheld, just as long as their passengers know the existence of the handheld and how to turn it on to 1215 and push the talk switch, that can bring a lot of help very quickly. If they have cell phone, turn it on. Even if they have no signal and can't reach anybody, leave it on. Because sometimes cell phone forensics allow us to at least get some trace signal and figure out where the wreck site is.
It's also a good idea to give a brief introduction to the aircraft's built-in radios. Point out where the master switch, avionics master, and transmit button are located, as well as how to tune in the emergency frequency. In some aircraft, the ELT can be turned on with a switch in the cockpit. If the aircraft is so equipped, show passengers where the switch is. Some pilots carry personal locator beacons, or PLBs. These are often more effective than normal 121.5 MHz ELTs.
PLBs are another good technology. They're less expensive than an ELT, but what you lose there is the automatic crash activation. So you actually have to have manual user intervention to set it off. And we've had a number of cases where pilots are incapacitated or die in the accident, in which a 406 PLB would have been useless because the passengers in the aircraft didn't know it existed.
Aircraft that operate in remote areas are sometimes equipped with satellite phones. If there's one aboard, make sure your passengers know about it. In the Ted Stevens crash, a functional satellite phone sat unused for hours, simply because none of the passengers knew it was there. While reviewing communication gear, brief passengers about any survival equipment aboard the aircraft. The bottom line is, if something in the aircraft could help your passengers get help or survive longer at the accident scene, be sure to tell them about it.
And it doesn't need to be a 10-minute briefing every time you get an aircraft. But if you have a new, naive passenger in an aircraft, these are good things to tell them before you take off.
Now, let's listen to an example of a real-life briefing.
All right, guys, before we get started today, I just want to take a couple minutes to give you all a quick safety briefing. First of all, please make sure that your seatbelts are buckled. In this airplane, they work just the way they do in a car. Please leave them on for the entire flight, just in case we hit some turbulence or something like that. Also, the doors in this airplane are a little different than normal. So the main canopy here has just one latch over here by me. And to open, you're just going to pull the latch back and lift up. The rear canopy is the same. Now, I'm not expecting any problems, but if something were to happen and we had to make a crash landing and the doors jammed, you could try kicking out the windows with your feet. There's a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall by your feet, Kristen. All right, like I said, I'm not expecting any problems, but just in case, we are going to be flying over some rough territory today, and I want to go over a couple of things in case something were to happen and I couldn't help you. All this stuff is printed on safety cards in your seat pockets, so it's okay if you don't remember it all. All right, first, to signal rescuers, there's an emergency radio beacon. Now, it should come on automatically, but there's also a switch over here if you can want to turn it on manually. Right, now, your cell phones might not work, and if that's the case, you'll have to use a radio to call for help. It's probably best to use the handheld radio I keep in my flight bag first. You just turn the knob to turn it on, hold down on the mic button, and talk. It's already set to the emergency frequency, which is 121.5. Now, don't give up too easily. You might have to call for a long time before someone hears you. Now, if that doesn't work, you're going to have to use the main radio, and that's a little more complicated. First, you have to make sure that the red battery switch over here is turned on. You can use this knob here to tune to the emergency frequency, which is 121.5. Hit the double arrow button here and press down on the button on the stick to transmit. You're going to have to use the headset to listen and talk. Finally, in the baggage area behind the back seats, there's a small survival kit in an orange box. It's got a first aid kit in there as well as some other gear. Also, by the way, for flagging down rescue planes, the silver space blanket works really well, just so you know. All right, that's about it. Do you guys have any questions? No? All right, let's get going.
It's a very bad idea to wander away from that accident site. Unless you can see the road or civilization or something that's very close by, then it's definitely a bad idea, because more times than not, we will find the accident site first. And trying to spot a person from the air is almost impossible. In the wilderness, for instance, something that may look like it's just a 1 hour walk away could turn into a full day. In other words, you could get yourself so lost that after they find the airplane, they may never find you.
Before we go, here are a few other points to help you give an effective briefing. First, it's best to do the briefing prior to starting the engine rather than just before takeoff. You'll be less tempted to rush, and the passengers will be less distracted. Take your time and specifically point out the locations of items. Second, try to see things from the non-pilot's perspective. Sure, the radio seems simple, but is it really? Have you actually thought through the steps required to use it? Things that are obvious to us as pilots may be anything but obvious to passengers, particularly when they've just been in an accident. Last but not least, a point that's as important as anything we've talked about so far. In the grand scheme of things, perhaps the biggest favor you can do your passengers is to make sure someone will be looking for them in a reasonable period of time after an accident.
In all the cases where we found an accident site quickly, they were inevitably had a flight plan and they were following the flight plan. That's the most important thing pilots can do to maximize survivability, is to be where we expect to find them.
It's also a good idea to have a safety briefing card with emergency communications and survival information accessible from every passenger seat in the aircraft. The Air Safety Institute has developed a free, customizable briefing card you can download and use. Find it at www.airsafetyinstitute.org. No one likes to dwell on the possibility of an accident, particularly when introducing non-pilots to GA. But for most passengers, a briefing like this is actually reassuring. It shows your professionalism and concern for their well-being and lets them know that you take safety seriously. Odds are they'll never have to use the information, but if the worst ever happens, it might just save their lives.